Life on our planet is under threat, and the evidence of it has never been clearer. In the year 2022, the world saw one of its worst climate disasters. Let's now take a quick look back at what happened across the world. In east of Africa, a prolonged drought forced many families to leave behind their homes as they struggled to feed themselves. Somalia is still bearing the brunt of its longest drought spell in at least 40 years. Due to 4 failed rainy seasons in a row and no sight of rain in the near future, the people of Somalia are now facing a brutal famine. The residents are left with no choice but to relocate and live in makeshift camps in search of assistance. According to the UN, there has been a threefold rise in displacement in Somalia since the beginning of last year as people desperately leave their communities in search of water and food. Hospitals in the country were also overcrowded, with severely malnourished adults and children waiting for medical aid. In the summer of 2022, we all saw what happened across Europe. These were unreal scenes as the mercury kept on rising in the continent. Europeans hadn't seen such climate in their lifetime. The erratic weather became the norm, and it kept breaking previous records. In the United Kingdom, a heat wave swept across the UK with temperatures soaring to 40 degrees Celsius. In many parts of the world, this would be no big deal, but 40 degrees is the average summer temperature for some countries. But for the United Kingdom, it is definitely not the case. The British record was 38.7 degrees Celsius set in 2019. But on the 19th of July last year, that record was broken, and now it stands at 40.3 degrees Celsius. Meanwhile, in Spain, wildfires wreaked havoc in the country. The fire in Avila province forced hundreds of people to flee their homes. This came as parts of the country sweltered under soaring temperatures. While Europe was facing the heat, Pakistan was facing one of its worst floods. In August, Pakistan was devastated by catastrophic flooding. The unprecedented monsoon rain killed more than 1,700 people and left the inundated country with an economic mess exceeding some $30 billion. According to the World Bank report, the loss of jobs, livestock, harvests, houses and the closure of schools, as well as rising food costs, has now threatened to put up to 9 million people in poverty. And to address this issue and bring some relief to Pakistan, the Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif is now in Geneva, which is co-hosting the International Conference of Climate Resilient Pakistan, alongside UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. And the purpose of this meeting, which is being attended by heads of state and government, is to garner international support to rehabilitate the population affected by floods and further reconstruct damaged infrastructure. According to the organizers, delegates from 40 countries will attend the International Conference on Climate Resilient Pakistan. Meanwhile, the UN Secretary General Guterres called for massive support to help Pakistan with a $16 billion rebuilding effort following the devastating floods. He also said that the country had been the victim of climate chaos. The conference comes despite the fact when scores of nations agreed on a historic loss and damage fund at the UN Climate Summit COP27 that was held in Egypt. The agreement aims at helping poorer or developing nations financially. These were, of course, battered by extreme weather events caused by climate change. For more analysis, joining us now is Svein Tevedal from Arendal in Norway. He is the Director of Climate 2020 as well as the former Assistant Executive Director of the UN Environment Programme. Welcome to the broadcast.
Thanks for inviting me.
Right, my first question, wealthy or developed nations account for most of the global emissions. How do you see these demands made by developing nations for damage?
Well, of course, that is a very reasonable requirement from them to get global support for loss and damage. To start, just saying that the story you told just up to now is the result of a heating between 1.2 and 1.3 degrees. And if we don't change the development, we might come between 2.5 and 3, and then the situation will be much, much, much severe and worse than it is today. But if you look into the history of funding for poor countries, in 2015 in Paris, rich nations agreed to provide $100 billion a year not for loss and damage, but for mitigation and adaptation. And then there was a breakthrough in the last meeting in Shark and Shame COP27, because it was agreed that a new fund should be established to help poor countries with compensation for loss and damage. And that is exactly what we see in Pakistan today.
Right.
So the meeting that you refer, yes?
Right, but Swine, let's talk about the bigger picture here. As the weather becomes more extreme, such climate losses are also increasing. So do you think it's time that global bodies should come up with a formula of sorts to compensate the poorer and developing nations who are, of course, suffering due to climate change?
Well, that was the idea about the decision that was made in the last conference of the parties in Shark and Shame, Sharm el-Sheikh, but they didn't agree about any figure. So next meeting will be in Dubai in a year from now, and then they will hopefully come up with figures. And the demand will increase enormously over the next years to come. So that's why the meeting today in, I think it is in Geneva, where you have the Prime Minister of Pakistan and also Secretary General of the UN and a lot of other people. It is a kind of test on the willingness from the rich countries to really help the people like Pakistan that has not contributed anything to the global warming, and where scientists are saying that this flooding in Pakistan has been much bigger due to the increased temperature in the world. So,
right, just a final question there, Swine, just a final question there very quickly. How feasible is all this? Do you think that the developed nations, especially the Western world, has enough funds at the moment? Because right now, of course, we're talking about inflation. The global economy is at the risk of entering into recession.
Well, it's not a question about whether there is fund, because we are talking about a few 10 billions of dollars. But the challenge is whether the willingness is there. We fighted COVID. We helped Ukraine with the war. And now, actually, we really have to come up with a promise to help the poor countries with these big disasters they have had from the increased temperature. And we will have the first test from the outcome of the meeting that takes place in Geneva today.
Right, Swine, thank you so much for all those updates, and thanks for joining us on the broadcast. WION World is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.